Hi, so back in the library, this time to talk about another Disney and horror crossover, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, and specifically the second half, which is an adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So, okay. I've often said I don't normally have favorites, and I don't. I'm not generally. There are a few things that I'm like, yeah, this is my favorite of this. I certainly came out in favor of a favorite podcast, um, that kind of thing. But I'm not. When it comes to films, I don't tend to have favorites. Just as when it comes to books, I don't tend to have favorites. I like too many of them, for too many different reasons to actually do that. But I have an incredibly soft spot in my heart for our next one here, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and more specifically, its adaptation by Walt Disney Productions in 1949 for one of their package features. In fact, the last of the package features, I'll explain that in a second, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. So, a little bit of background, and I'm going to do my very best as a Disney historian, or historian of Disney, I should say. I've never worked for Disney in any capacity at all, but I am internationally recognized as an authority on the history of the Disney studio, Walt Disney Productions, and can certainly wing it very well on the earlier iteration Laugh-O-Grams, and of course the Disney Company. I can certainly talk quite well about that as well. So we're so in my wheelhouse with a crossover between Disney and horror. We are so in my wheelhouse, and I'm going to work very hard to keep it brief on the history side of this. If you are interested, I will talk some. I'm not going to just glance at it and run away, because I think it's important to talk about. But if you are interested in this, I am actually at some point, probably later in 2026, sort of later in August, September, October 2026. I don't think I'll be giving up the Gothic side of things by any stretch, because it is a study that I'm doing, and I'm writing Gothic horror now, and I love it too much to not do that. But I do feel an increasingly strong urge to commit my Disney lectures, my American animation history lectures, my history of Hollywood cinema lectures, and my feminist film theory lectures to video, and share them with the world on YouTube. I certainly have taught, I don't even know, hundreds, probably thousands of students over the course of my career. I was a lecturer full-time from the beginning of 2003 to the end of 2024. So that is, 21 years? Almost 22 years. Yeah, almost 22 years. If I'd carried on another month and a bit, it would have been 22 years. So I've taught these things to a lot of people. And I do want to preserve them, just even if only for myself. But certainly I think it's appropriate for this channel to bring together, as I did recently-ish with Snow White and the horror elements of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I really want to talk about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, or the adaptation of that, I should say, by Walt Disney Productions. Now, just to give a little bit of background as to sort of the conditions in which this film comes about, because it is one of my all-time favorite Disney films. It really is. And in particular, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow section of it, which is the second half. The first half is a fairly decent interpretation. It's certainly a very successful one not without its critics, but it's certainly a successful adaptation of The Wind in the Willows, or at least a section of The Wind in the Willows, and by Kenneth Grahame. And it's, it's a lovely little piece. Again, about a half hour-ish, the first half of the film, and it's a lot of fun. But for me, it was always the second half. And I actually first saw the Disney adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow not as part of this film, but on their televised Halloween specials that were done in the late 70s, early 80s on for broadcast on terrestrial television in the U.S. And I know that at least one of these survives on YouTube. Some wonderful soul who found it and put it on there. And I hope it stays there because I love it. I love this sort of thing, obviously. And that was how I first saw it. And I looked forward to it every year. And it was only later that I got to see it in its original context, which is as part of this package feature. Now, I keep using this term package feature. What this means is, okay, so we talked about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I did talk a little bit about how Snow White was Disney's first feature-length animated film. It's misremembered for all kinds of important reasons. It is misremembered as the first ever animated feature-length film, but that is not correct. There hadn't been many. They had not been in sound, they had not been in color, and they had not received wide distribution. And Snow White was full sound, full color, and got a major distribution. So it's incorrectly, and even at the time by a great many people, was misidentified as the first ever animated feature, and it wasn't. But, and Snow White was an enormous success, and I didn't talk about that in the video last time. I did put like a little addendum in text on screen, but I didn't talk about that. Snow White was enormously successful. In fact, until a couple years later when Gone with the Wind came along, it was the most successful, the most profitable Hollywood film ever made. Okay. Not for a long time, but certainly for a time. Its budget was estimated at around $1.2 million. You'll see different figures in different places. To get the exact budgets for Disney films is always challenging, or at least these animated features from the early years. But it made well over $8 million, which may not sound like a lot now in 2026, but for 1938, which was the year that it had its major distribution, mainstream distribution, it absolutely was an incredibly profitable film. And, paid for itself many times over, put the Disney studio on a very strong financial footing. And then they did Pinocchio and Fantasia, both in 1940. Pinocchio in February 1940, Fantasia in November 1940. And yes, this is all, I'm getting to my package feature here. They did less well. Financially speaking, Pinocchio really struggled. But it was light years ahead of Fantasia, which had an incredibly limited release. It only opened in 12 cinemas in the U.S. Because Disney wanted this to be shown in surround sound, and they invented a system to do this called Fantasound. That's what they called it, which many, many years later, some technicians looking at the plans, the technical drawings and all for Fantasound, were surprised, I maybe even shocked, to see how incredibly similar it was to the sort of earlier versions of Dolby surround sound that come along in the 1980s. But because of those sound systems, only a dozen cinemas in the U.S. One in Canada, one in the UK, actually put this thing in, or actually, showed Fantasia in its original form. And of course, 1940, by this point, this is true for Pinocchio as well, the Second World War had begun. This greatly limited the release of these films overseas. And, while the overseas market was not as big for Hollywood films in the 1930s, 40s, 50s as it is in the 2000s, 2010s, 2020s, and presumably will continue to be going forward. The U.S. market was the primary market. They still depended on overseas revenue. Disney certainly did. And because Disney was a very tightly run operation, it had very low margins for profit margins for its films, and its films were incredibly expensive to make. So, it was really hit hard financially by the constraints of the Second World War. And even where it was able to distribute, such as in the UK, it couldn't bring any of the money it was earning out of the UK back to the US. Okay, and that is actually really important. That they are not able to bring their UK profits back to the US, and so transfer them from British banks to American banks until well into the 1950s, I believe it is, off the top of my head. So they have all this money that begins accumulating in the UK that they're earning from their films, but until after the war, there's nothing they can do with that. And they actually begin making live action features shot usually in England, certainly in the UK, in order to tap into that money, because they need the money. They need to earn money. Because animation is not typically the most profitable form of filmmaking, particularly as Disney did it in this period. So, they make, as I say, they just do Snow White, and it is hugely successful financially. Pinocchio and Fantasia, far less so. In fact, just for the record, Fantasia did not break even on its production costs until 1963. That means 23 years before it paid for itself, okay? Then after that, we get Bambi. Beautiful film, critically successful, popularly fairly successful financially. And then Dumbo, which actually does very well financially because it's the cheapest animated film, a feature film that Disney ever made. And it is a sweet, lovely, heartwarming story, so it does far better. But by this point, the U.S. has entered into the Second World War. Disney has gone into doing training films and so forth for various parts of the U.S. government, and to include the U.S. military, and some for the UK, for Canada as well. And they're doing training films for some of the defense plants and all that. So they're doing them at or below cost. Disney was losing more money than it could afford to lose, basically. And there was also a strike at Disney that lasted for a few months during this time. It's not the worst of the strikes that hit the animation industry, and there are a number of studios that experienced these strikes in this period, but they are, it is still a strike. It does still hurt production. Disney is really struggling. And what they end up doing because you do not make a profit typically in this period from short subject distribution of any kind, live action or animated. And Disney's animated shorts are incredibly expensive compared to what other studios are doing. So they tend to lose money on them. Where they do make money through the shorts is actually merchandising. This is why Disney is so keen on merchandising to this day, is because that was their major revenue stream for the 1930s and 40s to a degree. Although, again, the war hurts that as well. So they are, by the time you get sort of to about 1944, 45 and the end of the war, in, of course, middle of 1945, August of 1945, Disney is deeply in debt. They've had to let a lot of their employees go just to keep afloat. Things are bad. And they did have some films in development. They had little segments that they had done because they had this idea originally with Fantasia that you would never see the same film twice, and that they could take out some segments, put in new segments, and it would always be different. It would constantly be changing. You would, because you never hear all the same music every time you go to a concert. Even if you go to the same band to a new concert of theirs, you're going to get different material in a different order. And that was the goal with Fantasia originally. It never happens, okay? But they have sections that they had animated more or less ready to go for this. And they have a few other things that they have, partly in development, maybe halfway into development. And they need to get in the feature film market, but they can't afford it yet. They've got to build themselves up financially in order to be able to hire enough people in order to do a new single narrative feature film. Okay. They wouldn't be able to do that until the very end of the 1940s, and they release Cinderella in February of 1940. But long story short, these films hurt Disney financially. Later, as time unfolds, they will be re-released multiple times. They will become hugely beloved classics, and they are fantastic films, But to turn a profit when it was most needed, that they did not do. And so between that and then, of course, all of the shorts that Disney is producing from really early 1941, late 1940, early 1941 onward, for the Canadian government, and then for various parts once the U.S. enters the Second World War, of the British or of the U.S. government. Bleh. For the U.S. government, training films, educational films, propaganda films, all sorts of stuff, and training films for some of the defense plants, on how to do different forms of riveting and so forth like that. So they're doing these films either at or below cost more often than not. And this is everything from, as I say, how to do riveting, different kinds of riveting, to how and why you should pay your taxes, your income taxes, how and why you should save waste kitchen fats, why you shouldn't waste food, you name it, because these films are found to be incredibly effective with the audience, with getting people to actually pay attention to them and learn from them. And so Disney is, and they see this as their contribution to the war effort. They don't complain about this. I could do an entire episode just on, Disney and the war. I could do this on one of Disney's most famous early wartime films for the U.S. government. In fact, their very first official one for the government, The New Spirit, where Donald learns how and why to pay his taxes. But they're not making money, and by the end of the war, they're really, really struggling financially. Disney has had to really pull back a lot. They have had to lay people off because they can't afford the salaries. It is really, really precarious situation financially for the studio. And what they come up with, because they know they need to stay in the feature film market. Feature films make a profit, as I was saying, in a way that shorts just don't. simply because they're on screen longer, and therefore you earn more money for them, because that's how film rentals worked, at least at this time, was that a film that was on screen for 7, 8, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, does not earn as much money as a film that's on screen for 60, 70, 80, 90 minutes. Okay? So they know they need to stay in the feature film market, but they don't have the money to do one. So what they end up doing is, as a solution, they take these various sort of partly finished projects, these little segments that they've been doing for Fantasia, for the, sort of the re-releases that they had planned but never got to do of Fantasia. And they start putting these together into a package, into a grouping of films, so that you get this very sort of episodic type film. And these become the package features. Now, there's six of them. I don't know why I did that. I do know how to count. There are 6 of them all together. It's late and my brain's not braining, as a friend of mine likes to say. And there's 6 of these films. And they can be divided really into 3 groups of 2 in terms of their thematic and stylistic content. 2 of these, and this includes the 2 older of the films, is Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, which I think a lot of people will have heard of those, or at least seen bits of these films in different situations as standalone shorts. So the Saludos Amigos and Three Caballeros, they actually come out of a tour of South America that Disney was asked to do by the U.S. government, the Office for the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, in what would later become the State Department, but that doesn't yet exist. And he's sent out to South America as a goodwill ambassador. He travels with a number of his artists. They gather materials and they produce these 2 films. And they actually had their premieres outside the U.S. Saludos Amigos premiered in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And The Three Caballeros had its premiere in Mexico City. So there's those 2 films. And I love all of these films, quite frankly. They're not very well known, but I am a fan of all of them because they all are doing something very interesting. Now, the next 2 that are often sort of paired together, although they're a couple of years apart from one another, are Make Mine Music, which debuts in 1946, and Melody Time, which is from 1948. These 2 are like Fantasia, but with popular music. And it's particularly in these two that you get some of those pieces of animation that they were going to put with classical music and used as segments of sort of re-releases of Fantasia. In these, they get put with popular music and released as part of these 2 package features. And Melody Time also includes a longer segment at the end that is the legend of Pecos Bill, and when he meets and almost marries but fails to marry Slewfoot Sue. And this is, I think, something, I think the evidence is there that they were planning to do a longer film of that, but they couldn't afford to. And then the last 2 films, Fun and Fancy Free, which comes out in 1947, and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which is the last of the package features. It comes out on the 5th of October, 1949. These 2 are very definitely comprised of different stories that are just sort of sliced or spliced together as, loosely, but nonetheless, in order to tell these stories in feature length, even though the segments themselves are not feature length. So to concentrate on The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad now, and we were going somewhere. This film is two segments. The first half, and this is, the clues are in the title. The first half is material drawn from, and a few changes, but drawn from The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, Mr. Toad. And the second half is an adaptation of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, if you've never read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, go read it. First of all, it's very short. It is not a novel even, it's a novella. Novellas are shorter length, I think sort of 40 to 50,000 words is the modern definition of a novella, or round about that anyway. And Irving's story, depending on how fast a reader you are, is an hour to an hour and a half to read it. So it is, as a novella, it is essentially a feature-length read. This is a one-sitting kind of thing. And you can find it for free online. In fact, there is an audiobook version of it available through the novel's Wikipedia, or the novella's Wikipedia page, which is just fantastic. And things like the Gutenberg Project, for instance, have made electronic versions of the novella available. I may end up calling it a novel without noticing, but it is a novella. It's not a novel. And you can buy it, of course. You can buy it in paperback form and hardback form, in ebook form. I ended up buying it. I needed it quite quickly during COVID for some. Oh no, not during COVID. It was well before that. What am I saying? But I was working at home trying to get a chapter finished on my second book, Handsome Heroes and Vile Villains, because I write about Ichabod Crane and Brom Bones in that. And I suddenly thought, oh gosh, I don't have my copy of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And I think I bought it on ebook for like 49 pence. So less than a pound, less than $1. Very cheap. Okay. So it's easily available. And of course, libraries will have it. Go to the library. Use your local library. Libraries are wonderful, good things. Use them. So, but it's a really short read. And it's a wonderful read. And I will confess, I knew this film well before and long before I actually read the novella. For all kinds of reasons. For one thing, because I was introduced to the Disney adaptation of it when I was a child, and the novella is, it's perfectly appropriate for children, but the language, of course, it was published in 1820. So linguistically, it's not a form of English that most kids would just happily settle down with. It is very old-fashioned. And it's something I've long observed, that a lot of children's literature that we, sort of read to kids, it is older. And therefore the language is old-fashioned. And I've even occasionally noticed that some very young children who get a lot of old stories read to them speak in slightly old-fashioned terms, which I think is just charming and it's lovely. But I think this is just that little bit beyond most kids. So that's one reason I didn't read it as a child. I was well into my 20s when I finally went, hey, I've never actually read this, and sat down and read it. And I, at this stage, was so familiar with the Disney adaptation that I literally could recite it. If, society collapsed and I needed to entertain people, I think I probably could now more or less recite the Disney adaptation, and sing the songs, of course, because there are songs. But when I sat down to read the novel, I was genuinely surprised how faithful the Disney adaptation is. Now, there have been a number of adaptations of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow over the years. The first ones go back to the silent era. I think 1911, 1912, I think is when you get the first ones. I haven't seen them. I haven't, honestly. I meant to look, and didn't get around to even seeing if these are available somewhere online to watch. I'll try and do that. Try and do that before I post this video and put a note on screen that says. But it has been adapted about between 15, 20 times. I think it is, depending on how you define that. Some of these are little standalone features or shorts. Some of these are episodes of television shows. You do also, of course, get the television series Sleepy Hollow, which I watched and I really, really enjoyed. Very different premise, that Ichabod Crane has been under a spell, and so he's basically been in stasis, for lack of a better way to put it, for 2 centuries, and suddenly he appears he's awakened in the 21st century and ends up teaming up with a young woman who is a detective, if memory serves. It's been a while since I've watched it, I have to confess. And so there's flashbacks to his own time period, but of course most of it's set in the 21st century. And so we get this sort of, Ichabod as not a time traveler, but effectively as one, and fish out of water and all of that. And then, of course, you also get the Tim Burton 1999 feature film Sleepy Hollow. Now, Tim Burton was a Disney animator, believe it or not. Not everybody knows this, but I think his fans certainly know it. That's how he begins his career in the film industry, is as a Disney animator. During the 1980s, he would definitely have known this film, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. I can definitely say he was familiar at least with the imagery of the film, because some of the mise-en-scène in parts of his film Sleepy Hollow is 100% taken from the Disney adaptation. But that film has almost nothing to do with Washington Irving's novella. It is doing its own thing entirely and just happens to have characters with the same names. It's entertaining in its own right. I love Tim Burton's films, most of them. I'm certainly a fan of Tim Burton, and I would happily classify myself as a fan of Tim Burton. But I will say this is not an adaptation of Irving. It's something else. It's inspired by it in the way that the Netflix series, The Haunting of Hill House, is inspired by, riffing off of, and borrowing names from Shirley Jackson's novel, but really has not much at all to do with the novel. Now, I'm fine with all of that, because the Disney adaptation, as I say, it is so incredibly faithful that when I finally sat down to read the novella, it felt like I'd already read it. Sections of the text are lifted straight out of the book into the film. And it's lovely. Now, it is literally jazzed up in some ways for the late 1940s. It is none of the characters have their own voices. It is entirely narrated in voiceover by Bing Crosby. There are also a few songs in the short, or in the film, and he sings those films, sometimes with other voices, usually female voices, sort of coming in as a kind of backup and choral and so forth, chorus rather. But it is a Bing Crosby. It is all Bing Crosby, basically. And, that's fine. I love Bing Crosby's voice, and he does a very good job of it. He does make some slight little, modern anachronistic things where he'll say things, he refers to Ichabod a couple of times as Old Icky, which is, a very late 40s sort of way to do that. But they're fun, and I have been known to go around singing these songs just because I like them and I like to sing. So why not? So, yeah. So, why am I talking about this film? It's horror. It is beautifully rendered. Now, it doesn't start as horror. Now, as I said, this is a package feature. The first part is From the Wind and the Willows. So it's about 35 minutes, 33 minutes into the film when that section of the film, narrated by Basil Rathbone, is brought to a close, and the second half, narrated by Bing Crosby, begins. The theme, by the way, that the link between these two stories is eccentric characters of literature, one British, one American. Okay, Mr. Toad's the Brit, Ichabod's the old Icky is the American, and it is American, and yet at the same time, it is very specifically colonial New York, late colonial era New York. For those of you who don't know your history of this part of the world, New York was, or at least parts of New York anyway, were originally colonized by the Dutch. It had a very, very strong Dutch presence, culturally, linguistically, and so forth, well into the 19th century. For instance, just as an example of how Dutch parts of New York were well into the early 19th century, Sojourner Truth, one of the great abolitionist advocates, so anti-slavery advocates in the U.S., in the years leading up to the Civil War. She was born enslaved in New York State and was a native Dutch speaker. She did not, I don't believe she learned to speak English until she was in her late teens or early 20s, thereabouts. Her first language was Dutch because the family who enslaved her spoke Dutch. Everyone around her in their community spoke Dutch. Presumably, her actual family spoke Dutch. That's how late into the 20th century, or into the 19th century that we're talking about. So even at the time that Irving is publishing this novella, and he publishes it in English, he is using all these Dutch names for these characters because it would be 100% appropriate. And there's a working theory that he is actually inspired to write The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, partly from experiences that he has in the early 1800s when he is with the Army, the U.S. Army, and doing work in New York, but also later in the sort of early mid 1810s, late 1810s, when he's doing a lot more traveling, and in particular sort of late 1810s, early 1820s, when he is living and traveling around in Europe. And it's believed that he hears, sort of German and or Dutch stories of these headless riders who, wreak havoc and terror on a community, and is inspired by that, but sets it in the Hudson Valley in New York State. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. This is how Dutch we're talking. So you have characters with names like Brom Bones, and of course Katrina van Tassel. These are Dutch names and Dutch customs in the story that come through, or sort of softened Dutch customs, because time has mellowed them and they've begun to adapt to the English and other settlers from other parts of Northern Europe who are coming into New York, particularly in the sort of late colonial, early U.S. period. And he publishes, Washington Irving publishes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow as part of a number of other stories that are the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. This is published in installments in 1819 and 1820, and he uses the name Geoffrey Crayon as a kind of pseudonym initially. Why, I don't know, but he does. And it is a huge, it is very successful. It goes even in this early period of its initial publication. This sketchbook is very, very popular. It sells very well. It establishes Washington Irving as an author, and establishes his writing career. And he did go on, of course, to write a number of other things. Probably the other really famous piece that he writes is Rip Van Winkle. And it was even translated into multiple languages at the time. If you want a little bit of a laugh, you can find some British, particularly English, reviews of the sketchbook from the early 1820s that seem really surprised that an American could do this kind of writing, and that an American could write such gift, could show such a gift for writing. Hey, whatever. But yes, Americans can write good stories. Who knew? So he's basing it, as I say, though, in this very particular historical time and place, and cultural time and place, and bringing into that stories from Europe that fit that place. These sort of Dutch and German legends into this very Dutch part of North America. And that is retained in the Disney story. They don't try to update the setting. They've got Bing Crosby narrating it, but they keep it with visually with a colonial setting, colonial costuming. Although the novel doesn't mention Halloween, the film does. But only in the sense that as the film goes along, Ichabod is invited to the Van Tassel's annual Halloween frolic, and they're having a Halloween party. Okay, in the novella, it is an autumn festival or an autumn frolic. And that's really the only major difference. And I wouldn't call that too major. It does update it a bit more to the 20th century. It does remove it from that Dutch context into a more sort of 20th century American context, but it still works. It's still doing effectively the same thing as in the novella. And the way that the story is structured, and this is the Disney, we're back to the Disney here now. The way the story is structured is the first part of it is really very comic. This, odd, gangly looking guy shows up in Sleepy Hollow to be the new school teacher. He's a weird, sort of laughable kind of guy who's very, very full of himself. The locals are all kind of like, okay. But, he comes in, he's very poor, he's not paid very much as the school teacher. He's an itinerant schoolmaster is how he's described. And, there's not much money, in teaching then or now. And he's a pretty crappy teacher. He seems very uninterested in actually teaching. And in the film, we see him, sort of going easier on the kids rather than disciplining. He said that, he believes in the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. But it behooved him to be on good terms with his pupils, especially if their mothers happen to be good cooks. That's a direct quote from the film. And, we then cut to, he's sort of about to whip a child, but he sees that the child is quite plump and that his lunch basket is this large overflowing thing. And so he just pats him on the head, and then the film transitions into a scene where he's at this boy's house, and the boy's mother is serving dinner to Ichabod, and, hey, he's going to eat well tonight. And the only time he stops fantasizing about food is when he first meets Katrina Van Tassel, and he falls head over heels in love with her. not least because her father is the richest farmer in the county. And he, intertwined with his fantasies of wooing and winning Katrina's heart are his fantasies of how he will one day be the inheritor through his wife of her father's wealth. And at one point he even has said, or, Bing Crosby in saying Ichabod's thoughts talks about, the old goat can't take it with him, and when he cuts out, that's where I cut in. It's very unattractive. Ichabod comes across as a very sketchy guy. Basically, to put that in more modern terms, he comes across as very sketchy. And meanwhile, there's another guy in love with Katrina, Brom Bones, who's this big, burly, roistering blade, always ready for a fight or a frolic. And he and Ichabod take an instant dislike to one another, and Katrina notices this, and she starts pitting them against one another, because she's more interested in Brom, but she spends a lot of time flirting with Ichabod in order to get Brom to finally, put a ring on it. And it does work in the end. But in part, it works because as suave as Ichabod suddenly becomes, he's a wonderful dancer. He sings well. I mean, he sounds just like Bing Crosby. All of that, he has perfect manners, all the things that Brom is not. But Ichabod is incredibly superstitious, which is an interesting contrast with his being a school teacher, that he is incredibly superstitious, and Brom finds this out, and he tells at the Halloween party the story of the Headless Horseman. It's actually a musical number, and it's the one time that we sort of get close to one of the characters actually speaking, because Brom sings the song, but it is Bing Crosby singing. Okay, and it's I won't sing it as much as I really, really want to, but the basics of it are when the spooks have a midnight jamboree, they break it up with fiendish glee. No surpassing the one that's cursed. It's the Headless Horseman. He's the worst. And then we get the legend of the Headless Horseman being told, finally in the film. And it's a wonderfully done segment. The lighting gets very low, and it's just the firelight, and it becomes very, very spooky. It was before everything has been very brightly lit. Suddenly we're very aware that it's now nighttime. It's all candlelight. It's dark in the house. This song comes along, and we see Ichabod engrossed in it and terrified by it. And he tries to hide it, He doesn't want Katrina to see how frightened he is, but he can't help it. He is frightened. And so the song ends, the scene fades, and now it's time for Ichabod to head home. And this is where everything about this film changes. We've had this very lovely, light, jaunty, Bing Crosby being, quite joshy and jovial, and, lots of great jazzy, late 40s type jazz songs, and it's all wonderful. And suddenly we're in silence with a lot of hyper Foley sound effects, so that we don't just hear the horse hooves as the horse he's riding is walking along the path. There's they're really loud clip clop, clip clop, clip clop. We're hearing the sounds around him, blades of grass in the wind, hoot owls, and all these frogs croaking. And because he's really keyed up, because where he is the path that the Headless Horseman supposedly rides, although he's been told that once you cross the bridge, the ghost is through, his power. Once you cross that bridge, my friends, the ghost is through, his power ends. So when you're riding home tonight, make for the bridge with all your might. He'll be down in the holler there. He needs your head. Look out, beware. Or the hollow. East Tennessee coming out there. Um, but yeah, so he's riding along, and this story is preying on his mind. And they take away all the background music, everything, and it's just very quiet. And even Bing Crosby's narration goes from being, very loud, lively and normal voice and all of that, to whisper, and even a trembling voice now and then, as he talks about, you never had the schoolmaster felt so melancholy, so utterly alone. And he hears in the sounds of nature, he even hears things like where it sounds like an owl flying overhead is yelling, or a crow or something is yelling, beware, beware, beware. And then the frogs are croaking, Ichabod, run away, Ichabod, run away, and all of this. And it is creepy. And just when he, is really panicked, and he falls and he realizes that what he thought was the sound of another horse running up on him was the sound of some cattails, the plant cattail pods hitting a hollow log that was fallen on the ground. And he and the horse are having a laugh about this. Suddenly we hear this, ha 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 ha, and boom, the headless horseman rearing up. The mise en scène is just so intense, so menacing, so well done. This is the one that people like Tim Burton have stolen quite shamelessly. And that is the moment when Ichabod realizes the headless horseman is real. He is in his sights, and the horseman is going to try and get him. And then we get this intense chase. There is comedy worked into it as well. The music comes back, but it's much heavier, much more intense orchestral music. Bing Crosby disappears from this, and it's just Ichabod's terror and the horseman's laugh, evil, heavy, angry laugh. The swishing of the sword as he tries to get Ichabod. And eventually, of course, Ichabod spots the bridge. He makes for it. There's some mishaps, but he eventually crosses the bridge. He looks back in time to see the horseman take what he thinks is the horseman's head and throw it across the bridge. And then it's daylight again. And, next morning, Ichabod had vanished. All that was found was, his hat, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. But there was no trace of the schoolmaster. Then we cut to a church. Katrina and Brom Bones are being married. We learn that there are rumors that, Ichabod was, not dead. He was just in another county, married to a wealthy widow. But of course the good Dutch settlers refused to believe such nonsense, for they knew that the schoolmaster had been spirited away by the headless horseman. And then we return to that shot, that wonderful shot of the horseman on his, his horse that's rearing up and flinging that jack-o'-lantern. Now, we never know for sure if it really was the headless horseman or just Ichabod. And that's in the novella as well, is that question of, was it Brom playing a joke, or was it really this headless spirit? And it's kind of implied it was probably Brom's in the novella. The film could go either way. And then the film just pretty abruptly ends after that. It does a little bit of the recap of the main theme song for this segment, and then it ends. And I adore it. I adore it. It's only about 35 minutes, but to me it is not Halloween if I do not watch Ichabod. Yeah, I have to. And I've always felt, ever since I was a little kid, that 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 film, and I'll just refer to it as a film, because it is often shown as, and has for decades been seen as, a standalone film. In fact, it's only really thanks to the advent of video, VHS, DVD, and of course now streaming on things like Disney Plus, that we actually are much more likely to see the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad sort of back together, as opposed to being shown entirely as separate standalone segments, which does speak to their nature. They were thinking of doing a feature film of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but because of their financial issues at that point, during the 1940s, they couldn't. So this was the next best thing. So yeah, I mean, it is a ghost story. It is, instead of the scared, lonely maiden, we have the scared, lonely schoolmaster. This terrifying chase, particularly through the woods, the imagery that's used, and the balance. And this is something that I think these kinds of films that Disney does in this period, when they do mix horror with, they do such a great job of mixing horror and comedy. And I think, these are two genres that do go incredibly well together. Each complements the other so well, because both help us to care more about the main character. And even as awful as Ichabod Crane is, once that horseman is chasing him, you are rooting for his escape. You don't want him to be beheaded. You don't want him to die. You want him to live. You want him to escape, because as smarmy as he is in some ways, and as awful at his job as he is, you still like him. You still want him to do well. Now, before we go, I do want to just I have to show this off. So this is a set of tarot cards that I was given recently for my birthday. And as you can see, they are the Legend of Sleepy Hollow tarot cards, done by Nick Lawyer. And the reason I bring them up, partly because they're really cool. Look at the back. Isn't that beautiful? But because the main reason is because he clearly is influenced by the Disney Legend of Sleepy Hollow adaptation, Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. That is almost identical, not 100%, but 85-90% how Ichabod looks in the film. When we get to, and these are such cool cards. Let's see. So, they're still new, so they're not. That is how Katrina von Tassel is dressed, and that is how the ball, the party scene looks when they are dancing. They're not all from the Disney film. For instance, we never see Mrs. Von Tassel, and that's clearly who that's meant to be. Mr. Von Tassel, though, we see a very similar image of him to that. Not 100%, but again, about 75-80%. But then other imagery that we don't, okay? That is a shame, but we don't. And there's clearly Brom Bones there as strength, because he's a big burly guy. So yeah, I just think that's cool. And I love that even though this film seems to be in some ways seen as a fairly obscure one, it really isn't. And I think the reason it's not is the imagery is so well crafted. And when the scary comes, it is scary. And everything about the way that chase in particular, Ichabod's walk or his ride through the dark forest, and then this being burst in upon by the headless horseman, it is wonderfully, wonderfully scary, in the best possible way. So yeah, It's great. The novella might be linguistically beyond what a lot of kids would enjoy. I think the film works, and I think most kids would enjoy it. Um, Maybe not little kids, depends on the child. This little kid definitely. But by the time they're sort of 7, 8, 9 years old, I think most of them could get on board, especially if you introduce it in just the right way. Maybe start with the scary stuff and then let them watch the whole thing or something. But anyway, that is all for now. And I can't believe I've talked this long about this film. I can, but I can't. And I will see you again next week for another episode. Till then, sleep tight. Don't let the nightmares bite.